Picture, if you will, the image of a knight, a figure cloaked in gleaming armor, astride a magnificent steed, sunlight glinting off polished steel as banners flutter high above a stone-castled keep. He lifts his visor to reveal calm, noble eyes. Around him, troubadours sing of valor, maidens cast admiring glances, and enemies tremble before his blade. The air is thick with romance and reverence. This is the story we have inherited of gallantry, honor, and the righteous edge of a sword. Children's books and Hollywood epics have painted it for us with broad, shining strokes. We imagine the knight as a paragon of virtue, protector of the weak, defender of the realm. His armor never tarnishes, his cause never falters, and his soul is as polished as his breastplate. But now, dear listener, let the veil of legend fall. Beneath the myths of chivalry and shining armor lies a much harsher truth, one of aching muscles, ceaseless toil, and unrelenting danger. The life of a medieval knight was not a fairy tale, but a crucible. It was a daily test of endurance, grit, and submission to a rigid social order. To survive even a single day in their world would demand more than mere courage. It would require the surrender of comfort, the sacrifice of personal freedom, and the willingness to endure filth, violence, and fatigue without end. A knight's armor, though majestic, was suffocating and heavy. Each movement bore the weight of discipline and fatigue. Meals were inconsistent, often plain and cold, eaten swiftly in dark corners or on the march. Wounds were frequent, and healing was slow, crude, and uncertain. Sleep came lightly, often interrupted by watch duty, alarms, or the aching echo of battle in restless dreams. And all the while, the knight remained bound by oath, by land, by the ever-demanding code of fealty to lords who might reward loyalty with contempt. This is no simple costume drama. It is a world where every clang of sword on shield echoes with the weight of survival, where loyalty is not a virtue, but a burden forged in blood, where the glory of battle is matched only by the horror of its aftermath, and where the ideals of chivalry are often little more than gilded lies painted over the brute realities of power. And still, the myth endured. Why? Because we, centuries later, long for clarity, for courage in chaos, for tales where right and wrong are drawn cleanly, and our heroes are forged of something more than flesh. But flesh they were aching, bleeding, and sometimes breaking under the crushing demands of their roles. So, weary traveler, you who dream of gallant deeds and epic quests, stay a while. Let us walk together through the narrow halls of stone keeps and over the bloodied fields of France. Let us rise before dawn in a strophed chamber, stretch aching limbs beneath stiff linen, and prepare for a day that offers no peace. We will explore not only the swordplay and ceremony, but also the hidden corners of a knight's life, the early indoctrination of youth, the suffocating weight of armor, the aching loneliness of arranged marriages, the raw filth of battlefield medicine, and the endless obligations to lords, land, and law. This journey is not one of spectacle, but of truth. And in truth, we find a deeper kind of respect not for the myths, but for the men who lived behind them. If you think you could last a day as a medieval knight, then sharpen your senses, lace your boots, tighten your belt, and follow me into the world as it was, not as it has been remembered. For history does not wear rose-colored glasses, and neither shall we dot. Imagine, dear listener, that you are but 7 winters old. The smell of hearth smoke still clings to your mother's skirts. and your world is no larger than the edge of your village fields. Yet today you are taken, perhaps not cruelly, but firmly from the comforts of home and kin. Your father, a miner, noble or a knight himself, clasps your shoulders. Your mother weeps quietly. You are dressed not in play clothes, but in a tunic newly woven, meant to impress. You are sent not to school, but to serve. Pagehood was the first rung on the long and perilous ladder to knighthood. At 7, noble-born boys were placed in the households of lords or other knights, both to remove them from indulgence and to immerse them in the rigid customs of the court. Here, under the stern eye of stewards and matrons, the young page learned the first lessons of obedience. Their days began at dawn, not with lullabies, but with chores: firewood to gather, floors to sweep, boots to clean. They fetched water, assisted in the kitchens, and carried messages across cold, echoing halls. They observed the noble's table, but did not dine at it. They watched knights prepare for hunts and war, yet dared not ask questions. In this unfamiliar world of echoing stone and high expectations, the young page quickly learned that silence could be a shield and speed a salvation. A late response, a broken goblet, even a poorly folded cloak might be met with scolding, punishment, or worse, a disappointed glance from one's lord, which burned deeper than any lash. Discipline was absolute, and dignity was a currency one had not yet earned, and yet a certain sacred rhythm wove itself through these early hardships. Pages learned not just survival, but subtlety, how to move unseen, how to listen for footsteps. Down a corridor, how to gauge the mood of a room before speaking. They learned the hierarchies of command, how to anticipate the needs of a knight, and how to carry themselves with the quiet poise of future nobility. When evening fell and the hearths crackled with weary firelight, the pages might gather under the tutelage of a chaplain or elder to read holy texts, or practice penmanship by flickering candlelight. For those who showed promise, there were lessons in Latin, arithmetic, and heraldry, tools of statecraft for the day. They would be called not only to battle, but to rule. But these were rare rewards, reserved for those who had proven themselves useful and disciplined. Most pages ended their days with blistered hands and sore knees, aching from hours of labor and bowed beneath the weight of unmet expectations. And yet they endured. There were moments of levity to rough-and-tumble play. In the yard, spirited competitions with wooden swords, laughter over shared crusts of bread, bonds formed between boys who would one day ride into war together, or stand opposed on battlefields shaped by the shifting tides of noble allegiance. And sometimes, perhaps in the dead of night, a page might steal away to the armory, gaze upon the burnished suits of mail, and imagine himself within them. Not a servant boy with straw in his hair, but a knight of renown, standing tall in tournaments, his name called before cheering crowds. But for now, he polished those same suits of mail, oiled the leather straps, and swept the dirt from the flagstones. For now, he bore the name of servant. This was the beginning. Not with triumph, but with toil. Not with glory, but with grit. And it would be many years, many cuts, bruises, and lessons later before the page could dream of donning armor not as a cleaner, but as its rightful bearer. As the page grew, so too did the expectations placed upon his young shoulders. The rough chores of the household were not abandoned, but instead woven into a more complex web of training designed to mold his mind, body, and spirit into that of a future knight. This was not education in the way we know it today. It was not gentle instruction, but relentless repetition. Not inspiration, but indoctrination. Physical training began in earnest by the age of 10. The boy's limbs, still lean and unformed, were driven into strength through relentless activity. From dawn until dusk, he was set to tasks that pushed him to exhaustion, running across uneven fields, climbing castle walls, lifting sacks of grain or sand to mimic the future weight of arms. His young body ached more often than it didn't, and rest was a luxury he seldom knew. He learned to ride, not on gentle ponies, but on spirited destriers and palfreys that would become his battlefield companions. The early lessons were brutal. More falls than rides, more bruises than boasts. A boy who could not hold to his saddle was no future knight. He was a danger to himself and to others. So they were made to ride until they no longer feared the horse's power, but melded with it. Swordplay, too, was introduced gradually, often with wooden wasters that left welts and bruises upon bare arms and shins. At first, it was games parrying and striking, lunging and dodging, but there was no laughter, only breathless concentration and the sting of a missed guard. They trained under squires or older knights, men who had seen real combat and bore the scars of it. These mentors held no patience for weakness. Every error was a lesson taught swiftly and, often, painfully. But the sword was not the only weapon. A page-turned squire would be drilled in the use of spears, maces, daggers, and longbows. Each weapon had its own rhythm, its own weight. He would spend hours lifting and striking with a wooden mace until his arms felt like lead. He would string and unstring the bow until his fingers bled. Repetition bred muscle memory and muscle memory, survival in addition to arms. Pages learned the disciplines of the hunt. Hunting was not merely sport, it was essential training for the battlefield. Tracking, moving silently, reading terrain, setting traps, and dealing the final merciful blow to a fallen beast, all these were skills that translated directly to war. The blood spilled in the forest was but a prelude to the blood that would one day stain their mail. Beyond the physical, there was the matter of bearing. A future knight could not afford to be boorish or clumsy, no matter how skilled with a sword. He must learn grace, how to bow, how to serve wine, how to walk with a noble's posture. He must memorize the codes of heraldry, recognize family crests, learn the appropriate forms of address for every rank and title. These refinements were not frivolities. They were armor of a different sort, the kind that protected one's honor in court, as well as on the field. Some training was spiritual. Pages were instructed in the prayers of the church, the holy duties of knighthood, and the tenets of Christian virtue, though how often those virtues aligned with a knight's brutal life is another matter. They attended Mass, learned to kneel without complaint on cold stone, and listened to sermons extolling piety, chastity, humility. These teachings would be tested later in the contradictions of real life. Failure was constant. Tears were not uncommon. But a page who could not endure did not advance. There were no second chances, no indulgences. To fall behind was to be left behind. Over time, though, something curious happened. The body grew stronger, more capable. Muscles formed where there were none. The awkward boy began to move with quiet precision. He could ride for hours without tiring, lift his training sword without trembling. What once seemed impossible, deflecting a blow, maintaining posture in armor, firing an arrow into a distant target, became second nature. Even the mind shifted. What had been fear became discipline. What had been resistance became resolve. The page had begun the long transformation into a squire, and while his true test still lay ahead, he had survived the forge of boyhood training. He had earned not only skill, but grit, and in the world to come, he would need every ounce of both. Pain was not incidental to the knightly path, it was central to it. It came not only from bruises and breaks, but from the shaping of a spirit into something obedient and unyielding. For in the medieval world, where strength was survival and weakness a risk to all, pain was seen not as cruelty, but as necessity. As the young boy transitioned from page to squire, the lessons grew sharper, the discipline more severe. A forgotten duty could earn a lash. A clumsy mistake during weapons training might be answered with the flat of a blade across the shoulders. This was not unusual. It was expected. These small sufferings were believed to build resilience, just as fire tempers iron. The body bore the worst of it. A squire's hands were a tapestry of calluses and blisters. His shins purpled from missed parries. His knuckles scraped raw from hours gripping the hilt of a practiced sword, would scab and bleed again with the next day's drills. Limbs trembled under the weight of mail armor during long marches or exercises. In winter, frostbite could gnaw at toes inside damp boots. In summer, heat boiled beneath layers of padding and steel. There was no comfort to be found at night. After a day of exertion and correction, a squire might sleep on a straw pallet in a draughty chamber beside other boys. The air rank with sweat, the scratch of fleas a near constant irritation. If he was lucky, he might have a woolen blanket. Not, he curled into himself and dreamed of warmth. But pain was not only physical. It crept into the mind and spirit. There was the humiliation of public failure, dropping a weapon, stumbling in a courtly bow, forgetting a noble's name. These small disgraces chipped at the pride of a growing boy, carving out in its place a more stoic, watchful nature. For to be a knight was to be seen, to be judged, to be measured always. And so the boy learned to bear it in silence. Emotional detachment, too, was cultivated, often subtly. A squire might befriend a fellow trainee only to see him dismissed or injured, unable to continue. Attachments were liabilities. One learned to mourn privately or not at all. Even love, maternal, fraternal, romantic, was distant, rarely expressed. A knight must be strong, and strength meant solitude. Yet from this crucible something powerful emerged. A strange pride took root not in defiance, but in endurance. Each new scar was a quiet badge of honor. Each hardship survived became a whisper of the knight he might one day become. Pain, though constant, became familiar, a companion, a tutor, more honest than any noble's praise. There were moments, too, when pain was transcended. During a long ride at dusk, when the world turned gold and cool and the sky stretched wide, the ache in his thighs might fade into a quiet sense of power. When a blow was blocked cleanly, a stance held steady under pressure, the sting of training became a surge of confidence. These were rare, shining moments when the squire could see the shape of the knight within him. Even the most severe masters, in time, might nod in approval, offer a rare word of encouragement. These tokens, hard-won, were treasured more than gold. Pain shaped the knight. It did not destroy him, it refined him. In a world where every day might bring conflict, famine, or war, it was better to be forged early and painfully than to shatter when tested. And so the boy accepted it, and in doing so, stepped closer to the unrelenting path of the warrior. For in the Middle Ages, one did not learn to be comfortable. One learned to be capable. To forge a knight, strength of body was not enough. The mind too had to be tempered, bent, shaped, and occasionally broken to ensure unwavering obedience and control. In a world governed by lords and ledgers, where failure to obey an order could bring ruin to a household or death in battle, mental fortitude was not an asset, it was a necessity. From the earliest days of training, boys were taught to suppress emotion and hesitation. Compassion, while honored in chivalric poems, was often treated as weakness in training yards and council chambers. A knight might be expected to show mercy in a tournament, but in battle or in justice, mercy could be mistaken for indecision. And so, squires learned the art of masking their feelings, of keeping their faces still while their hearts stormed. This discipline extended far beyond the battlefield. A squire had to learn the patience of ceremony, the boredom of diplomacy, the subtle menace of negotiation. He had to understand when to speak and when silence could save him. In court, a poorly chosen word could cost favor. In the field, it might cost lives. Every moment of training became a study in restraint. During sparring matches, a squire might be instructed to take a hit without flinching, to continue a drill though winded and bloodied, to bow politely even to a mock opponent who had humiliated him. Pride had to be swallowed, anger had to be channeled, fear had to be locked behind a quiet gaze. There was little room for softness. Letters from home were rare, and outward sentiment even rarer. Squires who longed openly for their families, who wept or complained, were often shamed or punished. The prevailing wisdom was clear. Better a cold heart now than a shattered one later. Emotional resilience, like swordsmanship, was learned through repetition. They practiced solitude, too. Long hours were spent alone, cleaning armor, studying heraldry, writing out lines of scripture or law. In solitude, a boy learned to marshal his own thoughts, to quiet his mind amid turmoil. This inner silence became a shield no blade could breach. For a knight might ride for days with only his horse for company, or sit in silent vigil before a battle, or wait hours before delivering a fatal judgment. Humility was another cornerstone of this mental shaping. Despite his noble blood, a squire was made to serve. He laced his master's boots, polished the silver, and stood silently by during councils. He was addressed sharply, corrected publicly, and only occasionally praised. This taught him to listen before he spoke, to observe before. He judged at times. The mental strain could break a boy. There were those who cracked under the silence, who grew sullen or reckless. Some were sent home in disgrace. Others remained hardened to the point of cruelty. The system, relentless as it was, made no allowance for delicate souls, but for those who endured. A different kind of strength took root, not loud, not boastful, but enduring. The strength to ride into danger with a steady hand. The strength to sit in court as men begged for mercy, and to weigh justice with a quiet mind. The strength to be alone with one's thoughts, and not be undone by them. And perhaps, most vitally, the strength to act decisively when every fibre screamed otherwise. For when the moment came on battlefield or scaffold, there would be no time to consider, no permission to waver. The knight must already be what the moment demanded. Mental hardening was the unseen armor, forged not in the smithy but in silence, solitude and restraint. And like steel, it was tested not only by what it could endure, but by how well it could hold shape under pressure. By the time a squire approached manhood, his thoughts had been shaped as keenly as his sword. He no longer waited for comfort. He did not seek approval. He acted, and that, dear listener, was the heart of the knight, not in muscle or metal, but in the silent force of will that bore all things without bending. By the time a squire reached his mid to late teens, a transformation had quietly unfolded. What had once been a boy, fragile, hopeful, uncertain, had become something sterner, steadier. The final threshold, however, still lay ahead, the sacred, arduous passage from squire to knight, and it was not given lightly. This transition was marked by a ritual both symbolic and deeply personal, the vigil. Before a squire could don the spurs of knighthood, he was expected to undergo a period of spiritual purification. For some, it was a full 24 hours of fasting and prayer, for others, even longer. It began with a ceremonial bath, a rare indulgence meant not for comfort, but cleansing of body and soul. The water was often blessed, the moment quiet and solemn. Then, clad in a simple white tunic, the squire would retreat into a chapel or a secluded chamber, there to keep vigil through the long night, alone with his thoughts, with only candlelight, and the faint echoes of distant prayers. He was meant to contemplate the weight of the path ahead, duty, death, honor, and sacrifice. No instruction was given in these hours, only silence. And in that silence, each young man met his future. Some wept, some knelt until their legs went numb. Others whispered prayers for strength, for valor, for the courage not to fail their lineage. For many, it was the first time they truly understood the cost of the title they sought. When dawn broke, and the first rays of light pierced the stone-framed windows, the world changed. The squire emerged, weary and stiff, but transformed. He was led into the hall, where lords and ladies gathered, banners hung in tribute, and the symbols of knighthood awaited him. There were variations across regions and orders, but the essence remained the same. Before all, the squire would kneel. Sometimes his master knight stood behind him, other times a priest or noble lord. A sword, often ancestral, heavy with legacy, was tapped to each shoulder. Words were spoken, of service, of justice, of defense of the weak. He might swear oaths aloud, or repeat sacred vows. His name was declared, not as a boy, but as a knight, and with that, the spurs were buckled to his boots. His sword, newly blessed, was fastened to his belt. A surcoat bearing his family's crest might be draped across his shoulders. And for the first time, he was addressed not as lad, or boy, or squire, but sir. It was a moment both exalting and humbling. The pomp and pageantry could dazzle, but beneath it all lay a grim understanding. There would be no returning. From this moment forward, he was a knight not only in title, but in obligation. That very day, or soon after, he might be called to prove himself. Some knights were immediately thrust into skirmishes or campaigns. Others were tasked with guarding roads, collecting taxes, or serving as enforcers for their lords. The glory imagined as a boy was often replaced quickly by the gritty reality of power and responsibility. The world looked different through the eyes of a knight. He had climbed the ladder, endured its trials, and earned his place. But now came the challenge of living up to it, of embodying the ideals he had sworn to uphold. Knighthood was not a culmination, but a beginning. The path ahead was longer, more treacherous than all the years of training behind him. But for those who had kept the vigil, who had faced their fears in the flickering dark, it was a path they walked with solemn pride. So ends the first chapter. of the knight's life, not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a vow in candlelight and the quiet weight of a sword across the shoulders. A boy had been shaped. A knight had been made. Asterisk with knighthood came not just prestige and pageantry, but responsibility immediate, unrelenting, and deeply mundane. The castle, that grand stone emblem of power, was more than a fortress. It was a living, breathing entity. And every morning the knight played his part in its awakening. Long before the sun rose high above the ramparts, the castle stirred. The baker lit his fires, the stable hands murmured to restless horses, and the low rumble of daily life began to echo across the flagstones. The knight, often roused by a servant or his own sense of duty, would rise from a straw-stuffed mattress. Tucked within a private, though sparsely furnished chamber, there was little luxury, perhaps a wooden chest, a rough-hewn table, and above it all, the draughty chill that seeped through ancient stone. He dressed swiftly, not in full armour, only a padded tunic and woolen hose, but every motion was precise. Dignity was a daily uniform. If he had a squire, the boy would be at hand with his sword belt, boots, and news of the household. If not, the knight managed on his own, practised in self-reliance. His first duties were not heroic, but practical. A check of his arms and armour was routine. Was the blade sharp, the mail rusted, the fittings sound? Then on to the stables, where he might inspect his horse or confer with the grooms. A knight without his steed was incomplete. The horse was both companion and weapon. Often the morning brought him to the castle yard. Here men-at-arms trained, squires practised their forms, and drills commenced with gruff barks from a weapons master. The knight might lead these sessions, or simply observe, correcting posture, critiquing strikes. He was both mentor and sentinel. Beyond martial matters, there were the affairs of a state. A knight, especially one who held land, was expected to oversee his fiefdom. He might hear petitions from villagers, resolve disputes between tenants, or review the accounts of a bailiff. These responsibilities demanded attentiveness one could not govern by sword alone. And then there were his oaths to his liege lord. Should the lord reside in the same castle, the knight would be expected to appear at morning court, an audience chamber where business, diplomacy, and ceremony intertwined. There he would offer counsel if asked, stand as witness, or simply lend his presence in solidarity. Meals might be taken mid-morning, usually bread, cheese, and watered ale. Often it was eaten standing or on the move. The idea of a leisurely breakfast was foreign. Work awaited, and the castle, like the knight, had little patience for idleness. The morning hours, those quiet, cold hours where breath steamed in the corridors, were a time of purpose. They reminded the knight that his title was not an ornament, but a function. He was a guardian, a manager, a figure of justice and labour alike. And though there was no poetry in counting grain or mending fences, these were the unseen threads that held the world together. Without them, no banner would fly, no sword be lifted. So the knight rose each day, not for glory, but for the 100 small labours that bound his name to his land, his house, and his honour. To be a knight was to live, not only by the sword, but by the subtle blade of etiquette. The castle was not merely a seat of power, it was a stage upon which countless social performances unfolded each day. Within its halls, a knight's bearing, speech, and manners could carry as much weight as his sword arm, especially in times of peace. From his earliest training as a page, the nobleman was groomed to navigate these intricate rituals of decorum. By the time he achieved knighthood, he was expected to embody grace as well as strength. He did not slouch in the presence of nobility, nor did he speak out of turn in the great hall. He bowed with practiced ease, kissed hands when required, and addressed every peer or superior by their rightful titles at formal gatherings. The seating order alone was a labyrinth of significance. A misplaced chair or an unsanctioned seat could provoke insult or even duel. A knight had to know his station and the standing of others, for honor was currency, and every glance or greeting could signal loyalty or contempt. Language, too, was a weapon. The knight was schooled in the art of measured speech, how to flatter without fawning, how to deflect insult with poise, how to command respect without overt challenge. Witty exchanges at court were common, and the unprepared could be humiliated publicly for a poorly phrased jest or a lapse in decorum. Music and poetry were not trifles but essential expressions of nobility. A knight might be expected to compose a stanza in honor of a lady, to recite tales of Arthurian valor, or to join in song after a feast. These performances were not optional. They demonstrated cultural sophistication and emotional restraint. Dancing was another arena of courtly refinement. Whether a slow pavan or a sprightly galliard, a knight needed to know the steps. Dance offered moments of courtship, of diplomacy, of rivalry, all played out with grace and rhythm. A misstep on the floor could be forgiven. Repeated blunders, however, suggested a lack of breeding. Even appearance was laden with meaning. A knight's attire reflected not only his wealth, but his awareness of fashion and propriety. Too plain, and he risked seeming careless. Too ornate, and he might appear vain. Every thread spoke to his taste, his alliances, and his status. Courtly manners also demanded emotional restraint. Displays of anger or jealousy were frowned upon. A true knight maintained composure even when wounded by words or insulted in veiled tones. It was a kind of armor polished, impenetrable. Hospitality, too, was a knight's duty. Whether hosting fellow nobles or tending to wayward pilgrims, generosity and decorum were expected. One's table was an extension of one's honor, and the feast was a canvas for both gratitude and grandeur. At the heart of courtly manners was the idea of service to one's lord, to one's lady, to the ideal of a more civilized world. It was through this service, this constant rehearsal of noble behavior, that the knight affirmed his place in the tapestry of feudal society. He might ride to war in steel and blood, but within the castle walls he fought subtler battles with words, with looks, with customs that traced back generations. And in these battles, victory was just as sweet and just as necessary. So the knight moved through the halls with measured step and quiet dignity. His sword was ever near, but so too was his song, his bow, his well-spoken word. For in the court, as on the battlefield, the true knight was master of many arts. In the life of a medieval knight, the rhythms of eating were as revealing as the clangor of swordplay or the solemnity of courtly ceremony. Food was not simply sustenance, it was symbolism, social hierarchy, ritual, and, occasionally, an act of faith. The great hall of a castle, where most meals were taken, was a stage of power and order. Her backed chairs and long oaken tables bore witness to daily displays of status. A knight would not eat where he pleased, nor with whom he pleased. His position in the hall was dictated by rank, favor, and the mood of his lord. Seating near the head table was a mark of distinction. A place near the doors or kitchens signaled something quite different. Feasts were lavish and ceremonial, often held to celebrate religious festivals, marriages, or victories. On these days, the tables groaned with roasted game, spiced stews, fruit tarts, trenchers of bread soaked with meat drippings, and pitchers of wine or ale. Music filled the room, jugglers and minstrels performed, and the air grew heady with the scent of spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, rare treasures from distant lands. Knights were expected to observe proper table manners, even amidst such indulgence. Fingers, not forks, were used for most dishes, so cleanliness and grace were paramount. A knight who slobbered or reached too eagerly might find himself the object of ridicule. Each bite was a performance, each sip of wine part of a quiet dance, of dignity. But these moments of plenty were counterbalanced by long periods of restraint. The Church exerted great influence over diet, imposing fast days often several times a week on which meat, dairy, and animal fats were forbidden. Instead, knights dined on fish, grains, legumes, and root vegetables, meals far more austere than their usual fare. Lent, Advent, and various saints' days punctuated the calendar, turning the table from a place of indulgence to one of penance. Fasting, however, was not only religious, it was also martial. Campaigns often led knights into regions with scarce resources. In these times, they survived on hard bread, dried meat, watered wine, and whatever forage could be found. There was no great hall in the field, no tapestry-draped walls. Meals were taken on the ground, sometimes cold, always brief. Hunger was as common as steel. Moreover, a knight might choose to fast privately, seeking spiritual purification or penance for sins. A hard crust of bread and a bowl of broth could become a sacred offering, a reminder of humility beneath the weight of armor and authority. Food also reinforced the social order. The lord's plate might boast venison and imported wine, while the knight received mutton and ale. Below him, the squires and servants made do with what remained. The division was not merely nutritional, it was political. Every meal reminded one of their place. On some occasions, knights were tasked with hosting feasts themselves. In such cases, they displayed their wealth and connections through the quality and quantity of food. To skimp was to shame oneself. To overreach was to court mockery. It was a delicate balance, and let us not forget the quiet rituals surrounding food. The prayer before eating, the washing of hands, the toasts offered to guests and gods alike. These gestures bound the act of eating to the fabric of knightly virtue, piety, hospitality, generosity, and restraint. For the medieval knight, then, the act of eating was never just about hunger. It was about honor, discipline, and the constant awareness of one's place in the world, whether amid the splendor of a Yuletide feast or the silence of a Lenten fast. The knight sat at his table as he did upon his steed, with vigilance, purpose, and grace. A knight stood tall in the medieval imagination, yet within the walls of a castle, his rank was anything but absolute. The social structure of a noble household was intricate, layered, and unyielding. Every title, every role, every whispered command reinforced a web of power that extended far beyond the gleam of a knight's sword, too. Be a knight was to live constantly aware of one's position in this hierarchy. He was, after all, not at the top. That station was reserved for the lord, or baron, perhaps even a duke or prince, whose word was law within the walls, and whose favor determined futures. A knight might be respected, even feared on the battlefield, but in the great hall, he bowed like any other dot. There were layers beneath him to squires, pages, men-at-arms, stable boys, cooks, stewards, chambermaids, and among them social distinctions, flourished. A household steward wielded more day-to-day power within the castle than many armoured warriors. A favoured squire could whisper in a lord's ear. Influence was not always marked by steel or bloodline, but by proximity and discretion. Knights were often landholders, but not always wealthy ones. Some served as household knights, essentially retainers who lived within their lord's castle, dependent on his hospitality and commands. Their freedom was narrow, their autonomy constrained by the expectations of service. Others held their own manors, overseeing peasants and collecting rents, yet even they were answerable to greater lords and subject to summons. Feudal obligation defined every thread of their lives. A knight owed military service to his lord, but also attendance at court, enforcement of local law, and management of his assigned lands. In return, he received protection and prestige, but these gifts were conditional and easily revoked. Clerical figures further complicated this hierarchy. The local priest or chaplain might lack knightly prowess, but held immense moral authority. The bishop, if present, often outranked even the lord in divine stature. Knights, sworn to uphold Christian virtue, were expected to defer to the church. In spiritual matters, regardless of personal conviction, even within their own order, knights were not equal. There were orders of knighthood, like the Order of the Garter or the Teutonic Knights, with internal ranks and rituals. A simple knight, bachelor, differed in prestige and privilege from a knight banneret. Tournaments, too, revealed this pecking order. Champions received accolades. Lesser combatants received bruises and broken pride. Women played a role in these hierarchies as well, often quietly but with striking influence. A noble lady could elevate a knight's status with a favour at a tournament or destroy it with a whisper. At court, marriage, too, could raise or lower a knight's fortunes. A union with a wealthy heiress might bring land and leverage. A poorly matched marriage could spell social obscurity. The system was both ladder and trap. A knight might rise through valour and favour, gaining lands or titles, but he could also fall, disgraced or dispossessed, through scandal or failed loyalty. Every interaction, every word, every gesture had to be measured. Navigating these layers required more than strength. It demanded political acuity, patience, humility, and sometimes a willingness to bend. For in the grand theatre of medieval life, a knight's role was but one among many, and the script, always, was written by those above. Thus, he learned to wear not only armour but diplomacy, to wield not just a sword but silence, to move through the corridors of power as carefully as he would a battlefield. And in doing so, he preserved his place not at the pinnacle, but within the structure, vital and enduring. Despite the pageantry and prestige of castle life, a knight's dwelling was no paradise. Medieval castles were fortresses' first homes, second designed to withstand siege, not to comfort their inhabitants. Stone walls, while strong, trapped, cold and damp. Windows, narrow and often unglazed, let in little light and plenty of draughts. Fires roared in hearths, but the heat seldom reached more than a few feet beyond the flame. A knight's quarters might include a bed frame of carved wood, a straw-stuffed mattress, a rough woolen blanket, and perhaps a chest for his belongings. If he was fortunate, a tapestry hung on the wall to help hold back the cold. In winter, breath smoked in the air indoors. Water in basins froze overnight. Rats skittered in the shadows. The scent of damp earth, smoke, and unwashed bodies was ever present. Shared spaces echoed with the sounds of labor clattering pots in the kitchens, murmured prayers from chapels, barking orders from grooms and guards. Privacy was rare. A knight was never far from the needs of his household, or the watchful eyes of servants and superiors alike. Sanitation was primitive. Privies essentially holes in stone ledges emptied into cesspits or castle moats. Chamber pots were dumped with little ceremony, and even the highest-ranking knights accepted the ever-present odor as a fact of life. Washing was done with cold water and rough cloths. Soap, when available, was harsh and lye-based. The air within castle walls was thick with smoke from torches, braziers, and fireplaces. Ventilation was poor, especially in great halls, crowded with people and lit with flickering flame. Soot clung to walls and lungs alike. Eyes burned, heads ached, yet even amidst the discomforts, there was beauty. Light filtering through stained glass windows created pockets of color on stone floors. The flicker of candlelight on a polished helm had its own solemn grace. The sound of a lute, echoing through the corridors, softened the chill. A warm bowl of pottage, shared in good company, could feel like a feast. Knights learned to live in these contradictions, to find pride in endurance, peace in routine. The castle might be cold and crowded, but it was also secure. Its walls held back enemies, yes, but also the chaos of a world ever on the brink of upheaval. And so the knight rose in the morning, not expecting comfort, but resolve. He stepped across cold stones with calloused feet, wrapped himself in wool and silence, and took his place in a home that did not pamper, but prepared. The castle, for all its chill and clamour, was a crucible. It shaped him not just for war, but for a life of service and duty, one cold corridor at a time. Step into the flickering candlelight of a medieval great hall, and you may glimpse what centuries of poets and troubadours have painted: the knight, in shining armour, gazing longingly at a noble lady, a secret token exchanged beneath the table, verses composed in whispered devotion. But, dear listener, these images, tender as they may seem, often mask a more tangled truth. The reality of romantic life for a knight was bound not in roses, but in duty. Marriages were rarely the stuff of passion. They were forged as contracts. Strategic alliances between families, sealed over parchment and witnessed by clerics and lords. A knight's hand was not his to offer freely, but rather a piece to be played on the chessboard of inheritance, dowry, and land. A knight might find himself pledged to a woman he barely knew, united not by affection but by obligation. The match might benefit his family's standing or expand their holdings, but love, if it came at all, often arrived much later or not at all. He was expected to honor his wife, to provide, to protect, but companionship, that was a luxury. Meanwhile, the courtly ideal of romantic love blossomed outside the bounds of marriage. Courtly love, as it was called, was a stylized, almost theatrical form of devotion. A knight might devote himself to a lady, usually one of higher status, and already wed, pledging to serve her, fight for her honor, and suffer in silence for the grace of her smile. These liaisons, sometimes platonic and sometimes not, followed strict codes. The knight became the lady's champion, composing poems in her honor, wearing her favor into battle or tournament. This was love as ritual, a dance of longing that rarely led to consummation. It was both a spiritual elevation and a performance, a means of displaying refinement and emotional depth. But such attachments were not without peril. A rumor of impropriety could ruin reputations, shatter alliances, or invite deadly duels. Jealousy festered behind closed doors. A glance held too long, a letter intercepted, a song sung with too much yearning, all could ignite scandal. Some nights did fall truly, deeply in love. There are tales of elopements, of forbidden romances that defied custom and consequence. But these were the exceptions, not the rule. More often, love was delayed, diverted, or disguised. There were also the temptations of the road. Campaigns took nights far from home for weeks or months. In distant towns or foreign courts, some sought solace in brief affairs or tavern company. These moments of escape could be sweet and fraught with guilt. Still, within the constraints of their world, knights found ways to express tenderness. A whispered prayer for a wife's safety, a trinket carried from a first dance, a quiet moment shared beside a fire, away from the eyes of the court. These fragments of real feeling, tucked into lives shaped by duty, remind us that even behind iron and title, there beat human hearts. So the next time you hear of the gallant knight and his lady fair, remember that behind the poetry lay politics, that behind the longing lay duty, and that behind the illusion of romance there pulsed a deeper truth, that love, like war, was a field both perilous and profound. The chivalric code oft quoted, rarely questioned, was the ideal by which knights were measured, even if they did not always live up to it. In its purest form, chivalry was a framework of virtues: honor, loyalty, bravery, piety, and courtesy, particularly toward women. It promised a moral compass for men trained in violence, and a measure of nobility in a world ruled by might. For the knight, the code was both a guide and a burden. It called him to be fearless in battle, yet merciful in victory, to serve his lord with absolute loyalty, yet uphold justice even when it placed him at odds with that very authority, to defend the weak while commanding the power to destroy. These ideals, when held aloft, offered a vision of heroism, but in the dim corridors of real life, they were not always so clear. In practice, chivalry was as much about appearances as actions. A knight's reputation depended heavily on the perception of others. Was he gallant? Did he treat noble ladies with deference? Did he kneel in prayer before battle and carry a token of love into the fray? The answers to these questions mattered deeply at court, where tales of valor were traded like coin. Public gestures were essential, lifting a fallen foe from the ground, offering protection to pilgrims, rescuing damsels from imagined danger. Such acts, performed in the gaze of others, reinforced a knight's status. But in private, far from the eyes of minstrels and scribes, the lines often blurred. Mercy could give way to vengeance. Courtesy might falter in the face of fatigue or desire. The code also placed heavy expectations on interactions with women. Knights were to revere the feminine ideal, to protect womanhood and elevate it. Yet this reverence was fraught with contradiction. Women were both venerated and controlled. A knight might dedicate a tournament to a lady's honor, yet possess little interest in her voice or views. He might write poetry of devotion while his marriage lay cold and distant. Still, many knights internalized the code sincerely. It gave structure to a dangerous life, direction to wandering hearts. The rituals of kneeling, of pledging service, of riding for a cause greater than oneself, offered meaning. In a world teeming with chaos, famine, plague, war, chivalry was a kind of order. However imperfect, it also served as a bridge between the warrior and the saint. Knights were encouraged to emulate not only martial heroes, but Christian ones, too. suffer with patience, to pray with fervor, to confess sins and seek absolution. In some orders, such as the Templars, the chivalric code was explicitly merged with monastic vows. The knight became both sword and cross, but with such high standards came inevitable failure. Few knights could truly embody all that chivalry demanded. Some bent the rules, others broke them entirely, then bought redemption with gifts to the church. Hypocrisy was not uncommon, yet still the code endured, not because it was flawless, but because it offered something to strive toward, and so the knight awoke each day to walk a narrow path between two worlds, one of blood and one of grace. 2. Falter was human. To keep trying, chivalrous. In that tension between the man and the myth, chivalry lived on, not as law, but as longing. In the woven world of courts and castles, where power and affection danced in dangerous proximity, love was seldom a simple affair, with arranged marriages, courtly crushes, and alliances sealed by whispered promises. Jealousy and intrigue were not rare aberrations. They were the water in which noble hearts swam. Knights, trained to restrain their tempers on the battlefield, often struggled to temper their passions in court. A favour given to another, a glance too long from one's lady, or the discovery of a private note, all could turn whispered envy into open rivalry. Duels were fought not just for honour, but for affection, and blood was spilled for far less than betrayal. Intrigue at court was not limited to lovers. Political ambitions often entwined with romantic entanglements. A knight might pursue a lady not only for beauty, but for her inheritance, her influence, her father's ear, and she, in turn, might feign affection to shield a secret, manipulate a match, or secure protection in a volatile court. Letters were passed under cover of night. Servants were bribed to deliver tokens or gather rumors. Gossip flowed like wine at feasts, and a knight's reputation could rise or fall on the wings of careless words. A jest might mask resentment. A toast might cloak insult. Every exchange held dual meanings, every gift a possible snare. Jealousy, when it bloomed, had few safe outlets. A knight could not easily challenge a noble higher than himself, nor could he openly accuse a married lady of infidelity without risking disgrace. So the feelings festered. Some turned cold and cunning, manipulating events behind the scenes. Others exploded in sudden violence, in tournaments, in alleyways, in hastily arranged confrontations beneath moonlit battlements. Yet, for all its dangers, intrigue had its allure. It was thrilling to love dangerously, to win the affection of one already pledged, to navigate the labyrinth of unspoken rules with grace and guile. It was a second battlefield, every bit as lethal and exhilarating as the one fought with blade and shield. Some knights thrived in this environment, their charm and wit as sharp as their swords. Others stumbled, undone by naivety or misplaced trust. Many lived with secrets, love hidden, betrayal endured, shame carefully buried beneath a stoic gaze. In songs, jealousy was a sign of passion. In life it was a source of wounds as deep as any sword. Thus, the knight moved through court with measured steps and careful words. His armor might protect his body, but not his heart. And in the quiet hours, when candles burned low and the castle hushed to sleep, he might stare at the rafters and wonder, was she true? Did they speak of him behind closed doors? Could he trust even those who smiled? Love, once thought noble and chaste, became a tangle of fears and ambitions, and in the shadows of courtly life, where loyalty and lust entwined, many a knight learned the hardest lesson of all, that the heart once unguarded, was the easiest thing to wound. If the battlefield tested a knight's strength, the realm of love tested his soul, and one of the most refined weapons in that emotional arena was the written word. Letters, often delivered in secret or under the pretense of diplomacy, were the lifeblood of courtly longing. They were the bridge between duty and desire, between appearance and emotion. A letter from a knight to his lady might be no simple note. It could be a carefully constructed tapestry of poetry, piety, and passion. He might begin with formal flattery, extolling her beauty as radiant as a saint's, or her virtue as steadfast as any noble cause. Hidden beneath these lofty comparisons were the true sentiments yearning, despair, admiration, sometimes even fear. These letters were copied, sometimes composed by scribes, and often rewritten until each word was as sharp and elegant as a polished blade. The knight, after all, was not just wooing the lady, he was crafting a legacy. A single phrase might echo in the hallways of court, in song or rumor. Reputation was fragile. A poorly turned metaphor or an overly bold confession could ruin both lovers. For her part, the lady might respond with equal artistry. Her words danced between encouragement and evasion, between mystery and warmth. She might offer a token of favor, a ribbon, a lock of hair, a sprig of rosemary with her reply, each gesture steeped in meaning. These exchanges were rarely overt. Much was left unsaid, left to be deciphered in late-night reveries and pained rereadings. Beyond letters, music was another tender frontier. A knight who could play the lute or sing was envied by many. Music softened the strict lines of chivalry, allowing emotions to flow more freely than in formal speech. It could cloak a confession in metaphor, hint at forbidden love or comfort. A grieving soul, a single ballad might carry the weight of months of longing. Minstrels often carried such songs from court to court, sometimes anonymously authored, other times known to be penned by noble hands. If a knight's love was spoken through melody, the refrain might echo beyond his lifetime. The tale of his devotion could outlive his armor, but with every lyric and line there was risk. Music and letters could be intercepted, misread, misused. A song meant for one woman might stir envy in another. A letter found by a rival could lead to blackmail or worse. And yet, knights persisted in their poetic pursuits. For what was love, if not a risk worth taking? In the stillness of the night, quill in hand, a knight might pour onto parchment what he could never voice aloud. He might speak of battles not fought with steel, but with silence, of victories not won by force, but by grace. And in those quiet words, his humanity, often buried beneath duty, rose to the surface. Thus, within the rigid world of chivalry and chainmail, there flourished a hidden world of fragile feeling. In letters and lutes, knights sought what sword and shield could never secure, the heart of another, freely given. For all the feasts and pageantry, the songs and sighs, the knight's life could be profoundly lonely. Beneath the layers of ceremony and steel, behind the carefully composed letters and practiced bows, was often a soul-craving connection, a human heart encased not just in armor, but in isolation. The loneliness began early. Taken from home as a child, trained in silence and obedience, the knight learned to suppress emotion as a survival skill. Vulnerability was not rewarded in the training yard, nor was it safe in the political currents of court. Over time, emotional restraint became second nature. Even within marriage, a knight might find himself emotionally alone. Marriages were rarely forged for love, and while some partnerships grew into mutual respect or companionship, others remained cold arrangements. The duties of land, service, and command often separated spouses for months at a time, and letters home could be few and formal. Friendships, though forged in training or battle, were often interrupted by allegiance, duty, or death. A fellow knight one day might be a rival the next. The complex web of loyalty to liege lords meant that personal bonds were fragile, tested constantly by the shifting tides of power. Even in the midst of crowds, loneliness lingered. A knight at court, surrounded by music and flattery, might still feel the deep ache of distance, emotional or physical, from those he cared for. He might speak in verse and smile with grace, but within him churned a longing for simpler, truer connection. Campaigning made this solitude sharper still. Long rides through wilderness, cold nights intense, the ever-present threat of death, these honed the sense of detachment. A knight might travel with companions, but he moved largely in his own mind, replaying memories, reliving choices, fearing what awaited at home or on the next hill. Some sought solace in prayer, others in wine or brief distractions. A few turned to poetry or quiet acts of kindness to soften the solitude, and yet many accepted it as the cost of their station. The more noble, the more isolated. A lonely burden worn as stoically as a helm. It was perhaps in the small, unexpected moments that the knight felt most human, a word of kindness from a stranger, the warmth of a loyal steed's breath, the way the stars looked when the world was hushed. Moments that asked for nothing but reminded him he was alive. In the end, the knight's solitude was not always sorrowful. Sometimes it was reflective, sometimes it was sacred. But it was real, and it was part of what made the knight more than just a symbol. It made him a man. So the lonely knight rode on, through fog, through fame, through fading years, seeking not only valor, but a place where he might, for a time, lay down his sword and simply be seen. The image of a knight, gleaming in steel, mounted atop a noble charger, conjures awe even now. But for those who wore the armor, the experience was far from glamorous. Beneath the polished surface of chainmail and plate lay a brutal, suffocating truth. Wearing armor was a torment all its own. Chainmail, or mail as it was known, was an interlocking mesh of iron rings, a full hauberk, covering the torso, arms, and often extending to the knees, could weigh up to 30 pounds. Add a coif, shoes, gauntlets, and a heavy helm, and a knight could be burdened with 50 to 70 pounds of gear before even lifting his sword. The heat, especially in warmer months or in southern campaigns, was stifling. Armor did not breathe. Underneath, a knight wore a padded gambeson, a thick quilted tunic meant to absorb the shock of blows. This layer trapped heat and sweat, often soaking through within the hour. Movement in such attire was draining. Every step, every climb, every twist demanded energy. Knights trained for years to build the endurance needed to function in armor. They practiced mounting horses, swinging weapons, and running in full kit. Yet no amount of training could completely mitigate the toll. Dehydration was a constant threat. Exhaustion set in faster. And in battle, where survival hinged on swift reactions, fatigue was deadly. Visibility was also a challenge. Helmets restricted vision and muffled sound. Breathing through a visor could feel like inhaling through cloth, especially once panic and adrenaline surged. A knight might struggle to hear commands, miss a blow from the side, or become disoriented in the chaos. Then came the rubs and chafes. Armor rarely fit perfectly. Even the best crafted suits shifted during movement, pinching flesh, bruising joints. Long marches in armor left backs aching, thighs raw, and shoulders knotted with pain. Removing the gear after battle was a painful ritual, skin reddened and sore beneath layers, in sieges or desert campaigns. Knights sometimes fought in partial armor to avoid collapse, but doing so left them vulnerable. The trade-off between protection and mobility was a grim calculus, and many bore the scars of their choices. Still, the armor was necessary. It saved lives. It turned fatal blows into bruises, arrows into nuisances, and gave the knight the precious seconds needed to retaliate, to where it was to accept pain as the price of power. And so, each morning of battle, the knight stood silently as his squire dressed him, piece by piece. As the last buckle tightened, and the visor dropped, he became something else, less man, more monument. But beneath it all, the man remained, sweating, sore, and deeply, undeniably human. To speak of battle in medieval times is to speak of chaos in its rawest form. There was no clean choreography, no noble one-on-one duels that lasted for minutes. In graceful silence, battle was noise and motion, fury and fear, and above all, confusion. A knight might enter the fray with a clear command, defend the flank, charge the enemy line, hold the bridge, but within moments, the clarity was gone. Trumpets blared, horses screamed, men shouted orders that were lost in the din. The ground churned beneath pounding hooves and scrambling boots. Dust rose in clouds, choking the breath and stinging the eyes. The rhythm of combat was nothing like training. It was not structured. It was survival. An opponent did not wait his turn. Blows came from every angle, sometimes from behind. A knight might swing once and meet nothing but air, swing again and feel the sickening jolt of steel in two. Flesh. There was no time to think, only to act. Armor provided protection, yes, but it did not make one invulnerable. A lucky spear thrust, a dagger finding a seam, a warhammer striking the helm with bone-shaking force, any of these could end a life in seconds. And even when a knight struck true, there was no time to watch his opponent fall. Another attacker followed, and another. The press of bodies could be suffocating. In close ranks, there was barely room to lift a weapon. Men stumbled over the dead. Some were trampled by allies, others drowned in their own blood. Horses reared, panicked, and sometimes crashed to the earth, pinning their riders beneath dot. And through it all, the knight had to keep moving. Stopping meant dying. Looking back meant opening one's guard. He relied on instinct, training, and sheer will. He swung until his arms were numb, his vision tunneled, and the weight of exhaustion threatened to pull him down. Victory, when it came, did not feel glorious. It felt like breath after drowning. The silence afterward rang louder than the battle cry. And then came the aftermath, the groans of the dying, the cries of the wounded, the smell of blood and fear and rot. No matter how many battles a knight survived, each one left its mark, a scar on the body, a tremor in the hand, a shadow behind the eyes. This was battle, not tale or song, but terror. And still the knight returned to it, again and again, because it was his duty, because it was his life, because in a world of shifting loyalties and uncertain peace, the sword was both his burden and his truth. To hold a knight's sword is to feel history in your hand, but also its heft. The weapons of medieval warfare were not delicate instruments. They were forged for power, built to crush bone, pierce mail, and sunder shields. For the knight, Every blow thrown was not merely a gesture of skill, it was a feat of strength. The iconic longsword, often romanticized in tales, typically weighed between 2.5 and 4 pounds, not cumbersome, but not light either, especially when wielded for hours in battle. Its length, often 3 feet or more, required both finesse and endurance. Each strike demanded balance, core stability, and relentless training. But swords were only part of the knight's arsenal. Maces, morning stars, and warhammers were designed to counter the very armor knights wore. Their blunt force could crack ribs through a breastplate or knock a helmet askew. These weapons were heavier still and required the upper body strength of a blacksmith and the coordination of a dancer. Axes with single or double heads were brutal tools of close combat. Their weight was concentrated, allowing for devastating strikes, but also making them unwieldy in tight formations. A knight had to anticipate his enemy's movement, plan his own angle of attack, and recover quickly, all while defending against return blows. Polems like halberds and spears offered range but came with their own challenges. Long and often unbalanced, they demanded precise timing and constant vigilance. A poorly executed thrust could expose the wielder. A missed swing might entangle the weapon in a corpse or shield, leaving the knight defenseless. Then there were the shields, typically weighing 6 to 10 pounds. They were not simply held, they were maneuvered actively, absorbing impacts, redirecting blows, and occasionally used offensively to bash and unbalance foes. Holding a shield for hours, keeping it in position, moving fluidly in tandem with a sword or axe. This was an art of its own, in prolonged battles or during sieges. Fatigue became the greatest adversary. Arms trembled, backs ached, muscles screamed for respite, and yet the knight fought on. He could not afford hesitation. His weapons were not merely tools, they were lifelines. Training helped. Sparring sessions mimicked the rhythms of combat, building not just strength, but muscle memory. Drills repeated until the movements became second nature. Yet, no amount of practice could fully prepare one for the chaos of real combat when sweat blinded the eyes and blood slicked the hilt. Even after battle, the weapon's weight lingered, in strained shoulders, in bruised wrists, in the ache that seeped into bone. A knight's hands often bore calluses so thick they cracked in winter. His fingers grew stiff with age. Some lost feeling altogether. The sword may have been a symbol of nobility, but it was also a burden, and every swing carried with it the toll of experience, the price of survival. If battle was chaos, then its aftermath was horror. The brutality of medieval warfare did not end with the clash of arms. In many ways, it began anew once the enemy faltered. The knight, raised on tales of honor and valor, often found himself walking through scenes that no code of chivalry could cleanse. Victory did not always bring restraint. When cities or castles fell, what followed was often a torrent of violence. Looting was expected, almost ritualized. Knights, alongside common soldiers, ransacked homes, chapels, and markets. Gold was taken, yes, but so too were household items, livestock, food stores, anything of value. In the haze of conquest, sacred spaces were not spared. Civilians, especially women, bore the brunt of this collapse. Though knights were supposed to uphold the virtues of chivalry and protect the innocent, these ideals frequently crumbled in the intoxication of war. Rape, murder, and forced labor were tragically common. The knight who had sworn to defend the weak might, in his darker moments, become their greatest threat. and even in formal battles, cruelty took root. Prisoners were sometimes spared for ransom, but not always. Those without means, or those seen as threats, might be executed. Heads were spiked on walls, bodies left in fields as warnings. Maiming was used not just to punish, but to terrorize. The field itself was a vision of torment. Wounded men crawled across mud, calling for help that would not come. Limbs were severed, eyes gouged. The stench of blood mixed with the stink of ruptured bowels and open wounds. Flies swarmed, and rats followed. A knight might step over the bodies of boys he once trained beside, unable to help them, unwilling to stop. The brutality extended into siege warfare. These prolonged encounters tested every limit of endurance and compassion. Starving defenders resorted to eating rats, dogs, or worse. Diseases spread rapidly. Once a breach was made, the storming of walls became a slaughterhouse, and if the attackers failed, they might be left to rot outside the gates, shot at for sport by archers on the parapets. Even when the fighting paused, it was never far from the knight's mind. His dreams were haunted by the screams of men, the sight of children crushed beneath stone, the moan of comrades dying slowly. PTSD had no name then, but its presence was etched into faces, voices, and silences. And yet, knights returned to battle. Again and again, some numbed themselves with prayer, others with drink. A few became cruel to cope. Many simply endured, carrying their nightmares like unseen scars beneath their armor. This, too, was the knight's life, not only the swing of a sword, but the weight of what followed, the knowing that honor, once broken, could not always be mended, and that some battles were fought not in fields, but in the quiet torment of memory. When the dust of battle settled, and the crows began their grim work in the fields, what remained was not only a landscape of ruin, but men shaped by it. For knights, the wounds of war extended far beyond the flesh. Some healed, others festered, and many could not be seen at all. The physical scars were the most immediate, gashes that refused to close cleanly, burns from fire, arrows, or boiling pitch, crushed fingers and shattered ribs. A knight's body, over years of campaigning, became a ledger of violence. A twisted knee here, a lamed shoulder there. Each injury reduced his effectiveness, and most were treated with little more than wine and bandages. Infections were common and deadly. A single cut, if ignored or soiled during battle, could become a death sentence. Amputations were crude and seldom survived. Healers did what they could, but their knowledge was limited. Poultices were made from herbs, prayers whispered alongside stitching, leeches applied to draw away bad humors. But the deeper wounds, the ones carried in the soul, were not so easily mended. Nightmares haunted many. Memories of comrades lost, of enemies screaming, of helpless innocents caught in the chaos. Some nights grew quiet and withdrawn. Others flew into rages, unable to explain their fury. These were the invisible injuries of the medieval mind, what we now call trauma. There were no therapists to speak to, no counselors trained in healing hearts. Instead, the knight was told to pray, to confess, to offer penance. And while some found peace in this ritual, others found only silence. They bore their pain in solitude, hidden beneath their duty. Veteran knights were often distinguishable not just by scars, but by the way they carried themselves. A slight limp, a far-off look during feasts, an aversion to crowds. They had seen too much, perhaps survived too much. The bravest among them were not those who rode first into battle, but those who stayed gentle in a world that demanded hardness. Some turned to the church, seeking solace behind monastery walls. Others withdrew to the countryside, becoming recluses, or minor lords of small estates, speaking little and watching the world with weary eyes. A few took their own lives, though such acts were rarely recorded or were cloaked in euphemism. Among those who endured, a kind of wisdom often took root. They became mentors to younger knights, warning them of the cost of glory. They urged mercy in combat, taught restraint with power. They had learned through blood and sorrow that strength without compassion was merely destruction. These scars that do not heal became a part of who they were, carried quietly, worn invisibly, and through them the myth of the knight, the fearless, unbreakable warrior, gave way to something deeper, the image of a man, weathered but enduring, still standing despite it all. So when next you picture a knight, dear listener, imagine not just the gleaming armor or the mounted charge. Picture the quiet after, the haunted eyes, the tender care with which he lifts his sword. For behind every banner flown and every dragon slain, there lives a truth rarely sung, that bravery is not the absence of fear, but the choice to carry on. Scars and all, asterisk, to live as a knight was to live beneath the gaze of God, or so it was believed. In a time when religion shaped every corner of existence, the knight's soul was expected to be as fortified as his body. Churches stood at the center of medieval life, their bells marking hours, their rituals sanctifying war. For many knights, faith was more than belief, it was a shield against the uncertainties of both life and death. From childhood, a future knight was immersed in Christian doctrine. He was taught to pray before rising, to bow before crucifixes, to kneel at altar rails, with head bowed in humility. The Psalms were as familiar to him as his sparring drills, and while his sword arm was honed through repetition, his soul was shaped by scripture, sermons, and sacred songs. The Church offered the knight not only spiritual guidance, but social legitimacy. To fight was no sin, if done in defense of the Church or the innocent. Crusades were declared holy endeavors. Tournaments were opened with blessings. Even the act of knighting often took place within a consecrated chapel, beneath stained glass and flickering candles, as Latin chants echoed off stone walls. Confession and absolution were critical. Before battle, a knight would often seek a priest to confess his sins, cleansing his soul in case death came swiftly. Afterward, he might do penance for acts committed in the fog of war, though how earnestly varied from man to man. Some knights clung to the rituals of faith as anchors. Others wore them like armor, more for show than substance. Faith also colored the knight's understanding of his role in the cosmos. He was not merely a warrior, he was a defender of divine order. His battles were framed as moral crusades. Evil was not abstract. It had a face, a flag, a creed that opposed his own. Such certainty gave comfort and justification for even the most violent acts. Yet this relationship with faith was not without complexity. The knight was both sinner and saint. He prayed with blood on his hands. He pledged humility while wearing jewels and gold. The Church preached peace, yet relied on knights for protection and enforcement. In this tension, the knight lived a man who swung swords in the name of the Prince of Peace. Pilgrimage offered one path toward reconciliation. Some knights walked to Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or even Jerusalem, carrying their sins with blistered feet and bowed heads. Others joined monastic orders, like the Templars or Hospitallers, merging martial duty with religious vows. For them, The line between warrior and monk blurred until both were one. Still, doubts crept in. Beneath the polished rituals and sacred banners, some knights wondered, could one truly serve God while wielding death? Was the salvation promised in Scripture truly within reach, or just another tale to ease the fear of dying? These questions often surfaced in the quiet hours at night before sleep, in the stillness after prayer, while gazing at candle flames flickering like spirits. They were not always voiced. To question too loudly was dangerous. Yet they lingered, shadows among the saints. Faith for the knight was not a simple creed. It was a journey marked by moments of awe, doubt, ritual, and reprieve. It gave him purpose, but not always peace. And in that struggle lay something deeply human, a man, armored not only in steel, but in prayer, seeking the divine in a world so often ruled by blood. To live by the sword was to court temptation, not just the temptation of violence, but of pride, ambition, cruelty, and vengeance. While the knight was molded to uphold the sacred code, he was also human, and that humanity, so rich with longing and limitation, made him prone to fail his creed. The church and society held up the knight as a paragon of Christian virtue. He was to be courageous, yet humble, fierce, yet merciful, loyal, yet discerning. But such ideals, though noble, clashed often with the chaotic reality of his life. A knight had power, and power is rarely neutral. To wield it justly was a daily trial. One of the most insidious sins a knight faced was pride. In a world that celebrated lineage and martial prowess, it was easy to see oneself as chosen, superior. The gleam of armor, the roar of the crowd at a tournament, the privilege of command, these fed the ego. And in that ego, the rot could begin. A proud knight might disregard counsel. He might see himself above the peasants who toiled, or the clergy who preached. In battle, he might fight for personal glory rather than cause. In court, he might belittle rivals or manipulate those beneath him. This pride, subtle at first, could grow until it hardened his heart. Then there was wrath. Warfare bred violence, and violence breeds more of the same. A slight could lead to a duel. An insult could spark a vendetta. A defeat might demand cruel retribution. Some knights learned to temper their anger. Others let it rule them, becoming feared not for their virtue, but for their cruelty. The knight also faced the lure of lust. Despite vows of chastity before campaigns and the ideal of courtly love, many knights faltered. Women were often viewed through the lens of conquest, another domain to be claimed. The church condemned fornication, adultery, and coercion. Yet the halls of power turned a blind eye when the offender wore a crest. Greed, too, whispered its temptations. Campaigns promised not just honor, but plunder, land, coin, titles. A knight might begin as a servant of justice, only to find himself counting spoils taken from broken homes. He might raise villages not out of necessity, but for gain. In this, the line between protector and predator blurred. Envy crept in as well. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal life, advancement could be slow and uncertain. Watching a rival rise through favor or inheritance could stir resentment. Alliances shifted. Daggers appeared not only on battlefields, but in ballrooms and backrooms. These were the sins of the sword, not taught in the training yard, yet learned through life. The knight who succumbed was not always shunned. Some rose high despite their failings, but others were quietly ruined, their names forgotten, their reputations eroded by whispered truths. And yet, the struggle itself mattered. To recognize sin, to strive against it, was part of what made the knight more than a killer in fine garb. It made him a moral being in a world built on might. Some knights wrote of their regrets in journals or letters. Others confessed with tears streaming down their weathered cheeks. A few took vows of penance, joining crusades not for glory but for absolution. The sword could serve justice or sin. The difference often lay not in the hand that held it, but in the heart that guided it. Not every knight who strayed remained. Lost. In a time where the boundaries between violence and virtue blurred easily, the journey toward atonement was one of the few paths that offered solace, if not redemption. This was the penitent path, a road marked by quiet repentance, humble service, and spiritual striving. Some knights began this journey voluntarily. Others were forced upon it by defeat, disgrace, or a burden too heavy to carry. Whatever the cause, the steps were often the same: confession, penance, pilgrimage, and at its heart, a longing not just to be cleansed, but to become whole again. Confession was more than ritual, it was release. A knight might kneel, not in armor but in shame, and pour out the weight of years into the ears of a listening priest. He might confess to killings that haunted his dreams, to betrayals that fractured friendships, to desires that left his soul hollow. Through tears, he sought the grace he could not grant himself. Penance followed, and it was rarely symbolic. Some knights gave up their lands, their titles, even their swords. They clothed themselves in rough-spun robes, took vows of silence, or wandered barefoot from shrine to shrine. Others performed acts of charity, feeding the hungry, tending to the sick, protecting pilgrims from bandits as they once protected kings. Pilgrimage was the most visible sign of this transformation. It took a knight far from courtly halls and blood-stained fields into the long, slow miles of reflection. On the road to Canterbury, Rome, or the Holy Sepulchre, he walked not with servants, but with strangers. He shared bread with peasants, knelt beside beggars, slept under stars rather than banners. Some went further still. They joined the monastic orders, Templars, Hospitallers, or even the humble Benedict. There they exchanged sword for scripture, battle cry for chant. Their days were filled not with training drills, but with prayer and labor. And in this rhythm, some found peace, but not all who sought forgiveness found it easily. The past clung tightly, scars itched in silence, dreams still whispered, and some wounds, even when cleansed, left behind a phantom ache. Yet the striving mattered, the willingness to turn inward, to confront the darkness one had created or allowed that took courage of a different kind. It was not the charge of the lance, but the stillness of the soul that proved most difficult, and perhaps, in these quiet acts of penance, the knight became something greater than legend. Not a hero untouched by wrong, but a man reshaped by remorse, a bearer of truth, however heavy. So when we speak of knights, let us also remember these silent riders, these cloaked pilgrims, these humble guardians of holy doors. They remind us that the noblest path is not without fault, but found in the longing to make it right. While many knights wandered the path of solitary penance, others sought structured redemption through religious military orders. These institutions, part monastery, part army, offered a place where a knight's martial gifts could serve a higher purpose. Here, faith and warfare became one. The most renowned among these were the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Teutonic Order. Each bore its own charter, dress, and rituals, yet all shared a common foundation: vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, alongside a commitment to defend pilgrims, protect holy sites, and serve Christendom through arms to Templars, clad in white with a red cross, were among the first and most influential. Formed in the wake of the First Crusade, their mission was to safeguard the roads to Jerusalem. But soon their power grew. They built castles, managed vast estates, and established an early form of banking. Still, at heart, they remained knights. Living simply, praying daily, training rigorously, and riding into battle with grim resolve. Life within such orders was both austere and demanding. The day began with prayer, often before the sun rose. Meals were eaten in silence, broken only by scripture readings. When not riding or drilling, the knights performed labor mending armor, tending stables, assisting in infirmaries. Brotherhood was sacred. Personal ambition was frowned upon. These warrior monks lived without the wealth or adornments that defined secular knighthood. Their swords bore no crests, their robes no silk. Status was determined by devotion, not lineage. They slept in dormitories, not chambers, and shared everything from food to chores. Yet, for many, this life brought a peace and purpose they had not known in the courts of lords. Yet the orders were not immune to politics. As their power grew, so did envy. Accusations of heresy, greed, and secret rites swirled especially against the Templars. In 1307, the French king Philip IV, heavily indebted to them, moved to dissolve the order. Many knights were arrested, tortured, and executed. Their leader, Jacques de Maille, was burned at the stake. With his last breath, he proclaimed his innocence and called down a curse upon his persecutors. Despite such tragedies, the legacy of the military orders endured. They represented an ideal, however flawed, that a man could live by the sword and still strive for sanctity. For many knights, joining such an order was not an end, but a beginning of discipline, devotion, and deeper purpose. Through these orders, the medieval world glimpsed a unique fusion of martial valor and spiritual integrity. The knight became not just a servant of lords, but of God. And though these institutions rose and fell, their memory lingers, reminding us of the complex and often contradictory heart of knighthood, to fight not just for glory, but for grace. In the grand chessboard of medieval life, where kings plotted and knights fought, the church remained a towering presence, silent, observant, and often decisive. For knights, this watchfulness was both a blessing and a burden. While the church offered moral legitimacy and spiritual purpose, it also scrutinized their actions, intervened in their affairs, and wielded influence that no sword could cut through. Clergy were often witnesses to a knight's most pivotal moments: birth, knighthood, marriage, and death. They recorded deeds, dispensed sacraments, and mediated disputes. A knight might wield power on the battlefield, but in the eyes of God and the Church he was still but a man, accountable for every deed. The Church set forth expectations. Knights were to defend the faith, protect the poor, and uphold justice. They were not to pillage indiscriminately or engage in wanton slaughter. Yet when these ideals were broken, as they so often were, it was the Church that stood to remind, reprimand, or forgive. This role placed bishops and abbots in complex relationships with knights, sometimes allies, sometimes accusers. Papal edicts carried immense weight. A crusade could transform a violent campaign into a holy endeavor. Excommunication could render a noble untouchable, feared not for his sword but for his soul's peril. Many knights, even those who scorned worldly authority, trembled at the thought of dying outside the church's grace. The church also policed morality. A knight's conduct with women, his loyalty to his liege, his treatment of the poor, all fell under clerical scrutiny. Some priests were lenient, others zealous. A sermon delivered at dawn could set the tone for a campaign. A confession whispered at midnight could decide the course of a life. And yet, this oversight was not always altruistic. The church held land, collected tithes, and played politics. Some clerics exploited their moral authority for influence, just as some knights exploited their martial power. Corruption, while lamented, was not uncommon. Still, many knights genuinely sought to live under the church's guidance. They built chapels, funded monasteries, endowed hospitals. They prayed sincerely, confessed humbly, and struggled earnestly with sin. Their faith was not theatrical, but raw, a grasping for light in a world of shadow. The church's watchful eye was thus double-edged, a source of comfort and control, mercy and judgment. For the knight, to serve both Lord and God was no simple task. But in navigating that tension, he revealed the very soul of knighthood, torn, striving, and, at its best, sincerely yearning for virtue. And so, as the bells tolled and candles flickered, in ancient cathedrals, the knight knelt once more, not in conquest, but in quiet communion. For though he bore arms, he also bore the weight of grace. Asterisk, when we imagine a knight, we often conjure a figure wrapped in steel, banners flying behind him, his hair brushed by a noble wind. But peel back the polished surface and you'll find a daily life less gilded, far grimmer, a life sunk in mud, soot, and the stubborn stains of existence. Hygiene, as we know it today, was a luxury far beyond the reach of even the highest noble. A knight might bathe a few times a year on holy days, perhaps, or before a particularly ceremonious event, but more often he lived with the accumulated filth of travel, battle, and toil. Water was not easily warmed, nor its sources always safe. Rivers bore waste as often as they did fish. The smell was something every medieval person lived with and rarely remarked upon. The stench of unwashed bodies mingled with smoke from hearth fires, animal droppings, rotting food, and human refuse. In castles, rushes or straw covered the stone floors and were changed infrequently, often harboring fleas and mold. Even the clothing worn beneath armor, a padded gambeson or tunic, absorbed sweat, blood, and dirt with little reprieve. There were no detergents, no clean laundries. Washing clothes was labor-intensive, often left to servants, and garments might be worn until threadbare. A knight's undergarments, if he had any, might rot from friction before being replaced. Injuries added their own foulness. Wounds were seldom sterilized, and infections brought pus, fever, and decay. A festering cut beneath a gauntlet could sour a man's flesh in days. Dental hygiene was nearly non-existent. A knight's breath could reek from rotted teeth, and pain might gnaw at him in silence. But perhaps most overlooked is the humble matter of waste. Chamber pots were common in castles, emptied when convenient, sometimes into the moat, sometimes from windows into ditches below. Latrines, where they existed, were dank and poorly ventilated. On campaign, a knight did his business in the open, fields or behind bushes, with no privacy, no sanitation, and no respite from flies. Food, though romanticized in feasts, was often meager. A knight might eat coarse bread, tough meat, and pottage, an ever-boiling stew of vegetables and scraps. Salt preserved meats, but in hot weather, food spoiled quickly. Illness from rancid meals was common. water could not be trusted. Ale and weak wine were safer to drink, leading even children to grow up sipping fermented brews. A knight, sweating beneath the sun, would drink deeply from such vessels. Knowing it dulled the senses but saved the stomach, sleep came hard. A knight might rest on a straw mattress, crawling with lice, beside comrades or squires. Privacy was rare, comfort rarer. Night noises included snoring, groaning, the scuttling of rats, the creak of wood, and sometimes the distant howl of wolves. So yes, dear listener, beneath the romance of nights lies the reality of stink and struggle, of garments unwashed, of lice in the seams, of a world far closer to the earth than we care to imagine. And it is in that grit, not the glory, that the true measure of endurance was often found. Beneath the armor and oaths, the knight's body was both weapon and burden of frame pushed to its limits, and, all too often, beyond them. For though youth may endure the brutalities of war and labor, time makes its quiet claims, and for the knight, the slow betrayal of the body came with little mercy. In his prime, a knight bore weight no ordinary man could dream of. Chainmail, surcoat, greaves, helm, all layered over a padded gambeson that alone could soak through with sweat in an hour. Each stride, each mounted charge, each sparring match chipped away at bone and muscle. But even in youth, the strain could leave joints swollen, backs stiff, and knees clicking with every bend. The toll compounded with age. Arthritis often set in early, aggravated by injuries never properly treated. A twisted ankle on the training ground, a sword hand broken in a duel, a cracked rib on campaign, these were not simply healed but endured. Medicine offered more hope than help. Herbal poultices, leeches, prayers. No surgeries, no rehabilitation. Pain became companion, not condition. And then there were the more grievous injuries, the crushed limbs, the lost eyes, the shattered hands. A knight who could no longer wield a sword might be retired to an advisory role, placed in charge of a manor, or sent to a monastery. Others lived on in obscurity, their martial glory behind them, hobbling through courtyards where once they had galloped. Even among the physical decay crept in, teeth rotted from a diet heavy in protein and light in cleaning, gums festered, eyes dimmed from years of smoke, sun glare, and midnight reading, ears battered by clangs of metal grew deaf. Wounds that had scarred over itched or ached in rain. Sleep rarely brought comfort. Old bones ached in cold weather. War wounds flared without warning. Some nights grew short of breath. Others carried old coughs that never quite left. In winter, the chill bit deeper into old wounds. In summer, heat made joints swell like ripened fruit. Emotionally, too, the body's decline often mirrored the soul's. A knight who once exulted in the tournament ring now leaned on canes. A man who once galloped in front of battalions now required help to mount a horse. Dignity became fragile, and with that fragility came reflection on what had been gained, what had been lost, and what had simply faded. Some aged knights took comfort in their families. They told tales to grandchildren, passed on heirlooms, and shared quiet mornings beside the hearth. Others grew bitter, haunted by glories past or regrets unspoken. A few turned to prayer, their once calloused hands now folded in peace. But perhaps, most poignantly, the breaking body reminded every knight, no matter how gallant or grim, that steel could not outlast flesh, that beyond all valor and violence, he too was mortal. And so, in those twilight years, a knight's strength was measured not in his strike, but in his stillness, not in the battles he won, but in the burdens he bore. And perhaps that, dear listener, is the quietest kind of heroism of all. Winter was not merely a season in the life of a medieval knight, it was a trial. It seeped into stone walls and stiffened old wounds. It froze the breath in a man's beard and turned the simplest act, like drawing water, into a morning ordeal. When the frost settled on field and forest, it became not just cold, but a quiet adversary, a slow, pressing weight. Knights did not spend their winters idle. There were lands to manage, tenants to oversee, and the constant maintenance of gear and reputation. But the rhythms of life slowed, cloaked in wool and candlelight. Fires crackled in hearths, but stone castles rarely warmed fully. Draughts slipped under doors, howling like spirits. Beds, stuffed with straw or feathers, barely retained warmth after the embers died. Clothing helped, though it was far from elegant. A knight might wear 3 or 4 layers, linen underclothes, woolen tunics, thick cloaks fastened with brooches. Fur was coveted, ermine, fox, wolf, sewn into collars and hymns. Yet for all this, the cold found its way in, toes blackened, fingers chapped and bled, joints ached, food became harder to procure. The autumn stores dwindled barrels of salted meat, roots and beans. Bread grew stale, water froze in buckets. Hunting was possible, but dangerous. The ground was slick, the forests ominous. A fall could break a limb, and in winter such an injury could be fatal. Illness crept like shadow. Coughs deepened, fevers lingered. The pox and plague respected no fire or faith. Healing was guesswork, wrapped in prayers. And if the village healer could not mend, the chapel bell tolled. Despite all this, there was also a kind of quiet beauty. The snow blanketed the harsh outlines of the world. Icicles sparkled from eaves. Tracks in the snow, hare, fox, stag told silent stories. And in the stillness, knights sometimes found time to reflect. Letters were penned, histories read, children bounced on knees beside the fire. Winter brought the knight home to hearth, to memory, to mortality. He could not ride far, nor fight great battles. He was, instead, simply human, and in that enforced stillness, perhaps a kind of peace could be found. Yes, dear listener, winter was no fairy tale. It was hard, it was cold, but it was real, and to endure it was, in its own quiet way, another kind of knighthood. The knight, armored and valiant, was not invincible. Not to the sword, not to time, and certainly not to disease. Plague and pestilence cut through rank and privilege with equal cruelty, humbling even the proudest of warriors. In the 14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe like a dark wind, leaving behind fields empty of workers and castles hushed with mourning. No training, no prayer, no swordplay prepared a knight for this enemy. It came not in battle but in breath, in unseen contagion carried by flea, rat, and man. Whole households perished. Knights watched wives, children, squires, and servants fall, unable to help. Some believed it a punishment from God, others a mystery of foul air and imbalance. Helmets and hauberks offered no protection here, only cloth soaked in vinegar or superstition hung in doorways. Even in times absent of plague, disease loomed. Dysentery ravaged armies more often than battle. Inflamed guts, bloody stools, dehydration. It was a slow, ignoble death, crouched in camps and castles. Typhoid, smallpox, and the fevers we now name flu, all stalked nights on the road and at rest. Hospitals existed, founded by holy orders and maintained by charitable endowments. But care was rudimentary. Bleeding, purging, and herbal poultices were common. A knight might wake to leeches on his legs, or drink bitter brews that curled the tongue. Surgery was desperate, often fatal, and performed without anesthesia. Quarantine was practiced in crude form. Red crosses painted on doors, camps isolated. But knights, social and mobile, were often the carriers. They brought illness with their retinues, their trophies, their tales. The spiritual toll ran deep. A knight who once prayed for victory now begged for survival. A man once celebrated in halls might die unwashed and alone. Mass graves grew, prayers multiplied. Faith was shaken, then clung to more fiercely. Some knights turned to healing, studying herbs or founding hospices. Others withdrew to chapels, taking vows to serve not the crown, but the cross. For a knight who could no longer swing a sword, mercy work offered new purpose, and always death lingered. It knocked not just at battlefield's edge, but in the cough, the rash, the chill. It haunted dreams, it tempered pride. Yes, dear listener, a knight's life was not simply about glory. It was a daily gamble against forces unseen, and in enduring them through courage, care, or quiet resignation, he proved his strength anew. A knight's world was loud clashing swords, whinnying steeds, roaring fires, the stern bark of orders, but woven through all this clamour was a quieter, more enduring presence, silence, not the peaceful hush of contemplative rest, but the heavy, oppressive quiet of burdens unspoken and feelings locked deep within. Knights were trained not to speak of pain, not the ache of a broken rib, nor the sting of grief. Vulnerability was not part of the chivalric code. It was a man's burden to carry sorrow alone, to bear it beneath steel and crest, even as it gnawed at him like a hidden rot. The deaths of comrades were felt, but seldom discussed. A glance across the training yard might land on the spot where a brother once stood. A feast might be a little quieter, a little duller, for the loss of a voice once hearty and bold. But words of mourning were rare. A knight learned to mourn with his silence, to raise his goblet in memory, then drink it down with the rest. Trauma was given no name. The shakes, the sweats, the restless sleep, these were not afflictions to be treated, but signs of weakness too. Be buried. Nightmares came and went, often to the rhythm of past screams. But the next day the visor went down, and the night rode on. Many nights were lonely, not for lack of company, but for lack of intimacy. Marriage was duty. Friendship was forged in loyalty, not always trust. To truly be known was a rare thing, and those who were known risked betrayal. It was safer to remain composed, aloof, to offer strength, never need. This silence extended to fear. A knight could not confess terror, even in the face of battle, plague, or judgment. He might pray silently, he might sweat beneath his mail, but he must not show it. Fear, like grief, was locked behind the same visor as everything else. And so, the knight aged with this silence. It deepened the furrows on his brow, it narrowed his circle, it made his smiles fewer, his stories vaguer. The pages and squires saw the gleam of armour, not the weight it hid, but some, in quiet moments, let the silence break. A whispered tale by firelight, a lone tear at a chapel's altar, a letter never sent, a song hummed into the wind. These were the cracks where the man emerged from beneath the myth. Yes, Dear listener, behind the battles, beyond the banners, there was the silence. And in that silence, the true cost of knighthood was often found not in blood spilled, but in words unsaid, in emotions unshared, in the quiet endurance of being human beneath the helm. Asterisk as centuries passed, and the clangor of battle faded into parchment and song, the image of the knight endured not as he truly was, but as the world wished to remember him. The memory of the knight became legend, shaped more by poets and painters than by chroniclers of raw truth. And so, what was once flesh became fable. Tales of gallantry were passed from hearth to hall. The knight stood, in these stories, as a paragon of virtue, brave, honourable, devout. His sword defended the helpless. His word was as solid as his shield. In the telling, his flaws softened, his violence justified, his suffering forgotten. The man was lost. The myth survived. Bards and minstrels embroidered the truth with rhyme and romance. Ballads painted knights with golden hair, unbreakable vows, and love that defied kingdoms. These stories warmed cold winter nights and inspired young squires to dream beyond their reach. Even the church sanctified certain figures, blending sainthood with chivalry, elevating mortal men into moral exemplars. Yet history whispers a more complex truth. For every gallant charge, there were burning villages. For every noble vow, a broken oath. The knight lived in a world of contradiction, upholding ideals in a realm rife with cruelty. But the stories rarely ventured there, and so the memory of the knight became a mirror reflecting what each age needed. In times of war, he was the rallying cry. In peace, a romantic echo. In nationalism, a symbol. In literature, a muse. The reality remained buried beneath stone effigies and stained glass. But here, dear listener, we pause not to scorn the memory, but to understand it. For in every myth lies a seed of truth, and in every truth the heartbeat of a man who once lived, once fought, once hoped. The knight in memory may wear shining armor, but the man beneath once bled, dreamed, and stood as fragile as you or I. The evolution of the knight did not end with his death, nor with his mythic memory in medieval song. Instead, he transformed. Through the centuries, the knight shed his mail and steed, his lance and lineage, and took on new forms, archetypes that would echo through history and culture. He became an ideal to chase, a character to explore, a symbol to wield in the Renaissance. The age of chivalry gave way to the age of reason. The knight's role on the battlefield diminished, but his moral example lingered. Writers like Cervantes, with his immortal Don Quixote, cast the knight as a tragic fool, noble-hearted but deluded, a man out of step with the times. It was a turning point. The knight no longer belonged to history alone, but to satire, reflection, and reinvention. By the Enlightenment, the knight had become a paradox. He was admired for his virtues, courage, loyalty, honor, but critiqued for his violence, his feudal arrogance, his blind faith. Philosophers saw in him both the promise and peril of moral absolutism, yet the figure endured, haunting paintings, novels, and political thought in the 19th century. During the rise of Romanticism and nationalism, the knight surged back into prominence. Monarchs styled themselves as defenders of old values. Painters depicted gallant riders in misty landscapes, rescuing maidens or dying nobly. Medieval fairs emerged, jousting tournaments were revived, and the knight became a cultural touchstone, a vision of nobility. In a world growing ever more industrial and impersonal, it was during this period that Arthurian legend, with its round table and noble quests saw a literary renaissance. Tennyson's verse breathed new life into old myths. The night became the dream of unity, of purity, of noble sacrifice. And once again, the man was overshadowed by the metaphor. In modern times, the night endures in even more fluid forms. In fantasy fiction, he is the paladin, the dragon slayer, the guardian of realms. In cinema, he dons capes or armor of another sort. In games, he rides again in pixel and code, giving new generations a taste of sword and honor. Yet there is also skepticism. Postmodern eyes view the knight through critical lenses. We question the ideals he stood for, the systems he upheld, the voices he silenced. Feminist scholars, decolonial thinkers, and moral philosophers unpack the biases behind the legend, and rightly so, for every symbol has shadow. Still, the knight's endurance speaks to something timeless, a yearning, perhaps, for courage in the face of chaos, for honor in a world of compromise, for meaning amid the mundane. Even if we no longer believe in the knight as he once was, we believe in what he might represent, and so he remains, not in castles or cathedrals, but in stories, in ideals, in hearts, a figure straddling past and future, myth and man, a reminder that the shapes we give our heroes say as much about us as about them. So next time you see a knight on page, on screen, in statue, pause for a moment. Beneath the plume and plate, ask what he means to you. What do you hope he defends? What dragons does he fight? And if you wore his armor, what code would you keep? For in the end, dear listener, the knight's journey is not done. It continues in every soul who dares to live by a creed, to lift the fallen, to hold fast against the storm. The armor may be gone, but the echo remains. Today the knight lives on, not only in fiction, not only in fantasy, but in the subtle expressions of values that echo down through time. The steel has dulled, the banners have faded, but the core courage, honor, loyalty remains etched into our cultural consciousness. Even in an age of technology and information, the knight speaks to something deeply human. You see it in those who serve without recognition, who uphold a personal code when no one is watching, the teacher who stays late to help a struggling student, the firefighter who runs toward flames, the nurse who holds a hand in the silence of a hospital room. These are not knights in armor, but their hearts beat to a rhythm that would be familiar to any squire-turned-warrior. In boardrooms and courtrooms, in laboratories and classrooms, modern knights wrestle dragons of a different kind: ignorance, injustice, indifference. Some wear suits, some wear badges, some wear nothing more than a weary expression and an iron will. Yet each, in their own way, takes up the quest. Even more profoundly, the knight's echo can be heard in the quiet acts of integrity. In a world where noise is constant and spectacle often drowns substance, it is the quiet decision to do right, without reward, that most closely resembles the silent vows once sworn in candlelit halls. And the code, it changes, of course. The medieval knight's chivalric code emphasized loyalty to God, king, and lady. Today's codes may be more personal, more inclusive. They might center on equality, justice, compassion, but the essence remains: a belief in a higher ideal, a devotion to something beyond the self. There is also a growing recognition that knighthood need not be male nor martial. The archetype expands. Modern knighthood can be found in women who lead with courage, in activists who speak truth to power, in those who use pen and protest instead of blade and shield. The battlefield is broader now, and so is the banner. In literature, the knight remains fertile ground. Writers reimagine him through science fiction, dystopian epics, and introspective dramas. He might be a weary wanderer in a galaxy far away, or a solitary detective in a city riddled with corruption. The costume changes, but the quest, the inner fire, endures in art. The image of the knight still stirs something timeless. Whether etched in glass, cast in bronze, or painted in digital hues, he remains a figure of longing, of discipline, of resistance against despair. And in you, dear listener, perhaps there is a knight's echo too. Perhaps you carry forward a legacy, not of conquest, but of conscience, not of fame, but of faithfulness. Perhaps, like the knights of old, you strive to rise each day with purpose, to stand firm when it is easier to flee, to speak truth even when your voice quivers. So the next time you doubt the relevance of a forgotten warrior on horseback, think again. For the knight is not lost. He is evolving. He is rising. In you, in us, in every effort to be brave, to be just, to be kind. And that, in this modern age of complexity and contradiction, may be the truest kind of knighthood of all. The legacy of the knight, dear listener, is not confined to the pages of dusty chronicles or the ornate tombs of ancient cathedrals. It lives on in the deep structure of our moral imagination, in how we think about sacrifice, leadership, and justice. The knight may have been born in a time of feudal lords and fiefdoms, but his spirit transcends those narrow bounds. At its most profound, the knightly legacy reminds us that power must be tempered by virtue, that with strength comes responsibility, not merely to oneself or one's kin, but to the voiceless, the weak, the unseen. A true knight, as he was once imagined, fought not just for land or glory, but for a sense of righteousness that defied mere self-interest. This is perhaps why the knight has proven so enduring across cultures and centuries. Even societies that did not share Europe's feudal history often cultivated similar warrior ideals, codes of honor, rituals of service, sacred duties to the people. The samurai of Japan, the Rajput of India, the Mandinka warriors of West Africa, each echoed the same central question: what does it mean to be brave and good at once? In this sense, the knight becomes less a historical figure than a mirror for our own aspirations. We look to him not because we expect to ride into battle on horseback, but because we, too, wish to stand tall in our own trials, to be unwavering in the storm, to protect what is precious, even when no songs will be sung of it. And so schools teach children about courage through tales of dragons and champions. Stories old and new speak of chosen ones and secret legacies. Films cast brooding heroes in chainmail or capes, tasked with defending a world that does not always understand them. These are not merely entertainments, they are acts of remembrance, modern oaths in narrative form. Yet we must be cautious, too, for the knight's legacy is not without blemish. It has been used to justify conquest, to glorify violence, to reinforce hierarchies. In remembering the knight, we must remember his contradictions, the chivalry and the cruelty, the honor and the hubris. To learn from the past, we must see it whole. Perhaps, then, the greatest tribute to the knight is not to emulate his battles, but to continue his search for meaning, for justice, for a way to live that lifts others rather than subdues them. Perhaps the real chivalry today lies in humility, in listening, in care, So if you walk the world with questions in your heart and kindness in your hands, if you defend without dominion and love without possession, then maybe, just maybe, you carry the legacy of the night within you, not in sword or shield, but in spirit, and in that quiet, steadfast spirit, the old world breathes still. Asterisk, and now, dear traveller, our long journey together draws to its end. We've walked the narrow corridors of cold stone castles, ridden under grey skies across muddied fields, and lingered at the edge of roaring fires where legends were whispered like prayers. We have not just followed the night, we have felt the chill in his bones, the ache in his heart, the hope in his silence. The medieval knight, for all his steel and ceremony, was profoundly human. His story, when stripped of polish, reveals a life of service and sacrifice, of burden and beauty. A life shaped not by the grandeur of tales, but by the quiet choices made when no ballads were sung. To wear a knight's armor was to carry weight real and symbolic, the weight of duty to lord and land, of love constrained by law, of violence veiled as valor. It was to hold one's breath in the hush before battle, to weep in private for lost brothers, to wonder if one's actions echoed with honor or just with habit. Yet within all of this was something resilient, something luminous, a glimmer of grace, like sunlight on burnished mail. The knight may have lived in a brutal world, but he sought, however imperfectly, to rise above it. And in that striving, he offers us a mirror, for we to live in a world of complexity and contradiction. We too face dragons, though they take other forms, fear, doubt, injustice, grief. And we too must choose, again and again, whether to stand or to kneel, to speak or to stay silent, to defend or to dismiss. The knight's tale reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the resolve to act with integrity in the presence of it. That honor is not a banner to wave, but a path walked quietly, often unseen. That to serve something greater than oneself is not weakness, but the deepest strength. So let this not be a farewell, but a blessing. May you rise each day with the heart of a knight, not with violence, but with valor, not with pride, but with purpose. May your words carry kindness, your hands offer shelter, your presence bring peace. And when you feel weary, when the world seems heavy and your path unclear, remember the stories of those who came before. Let their quiet perseverance kindle your own. Let the flicker of their legacy guide you, like a lantern through fog. Because the knight, in truth, was never meant to be a relic. He was meant to be a reminder that even in a world of cold stone and clashing swords, it is possible to live with warmth, with dignity, with hope. So tuck yourself in. Dear listener, draw your blanket close like a cloak of woven comfort. Let the flickering echoes of chainmail fade into dreams. Let the castle gates close behind us. And as you drift into that soft, velvety night, know this: the knight's story lives on, not just in history books, but in every act of courage, compassion, and quiet strength. Sleep well, gentle soul, and good night.